When I was growing up in church, my primary understanding of why I was a Christian was that I wanted to get to heaven. I had heard that it was great, that when I died, it was the place I wanted to end up because that's where I would be happy all the time, and there would be nothing bad there. Of course, as a child, the idea of my own mortality wasn't really on my mind, but I still knew that heaven was the goal and that I needed Jesus to get me there. As I got older, there started to be more requirements to get into heaven. Instead of just loving Jesus, I also had to start avoiding sins, and some particular sins more than others. Throughout my teenage years, I mostly just heard that I needed to avoid these really bad sins, which mostly had to do with my own body, and not the evils of things like racism or homophobia, if I wanted to know that I was going to heaven. At some point in my young adulthood, a faith that was only built on don'ts stopped being compelling to me. And while I knew that I still loved Jesus, I wasn't sure how much of a Christian I really was anymore. It actually took me leaving home, moving to St. Louis, and needing the community of a church to start me understanding that Christian faith had more to it than just a set of things that I should not do. In that church, I first saw Christians who were serving their communities, who were addressing poverty and a lack of available health care for their neighbors, who cared more about love and grace than about sin and punishment. It took another few years of me being involved in a church like that, and as an adult this time, for me to really discover that the actual stories of Jesus were not about the things that I shouldn't do, but were about the things that I should do, and more importantly, that way that I should be. That my life on earth mattered as much, if not more, than what would happen after I died. It was after I was already working as a campus minister and leading others in Bible study that I started understanding that Jesus' teachings, and especially his parables, were, for me, an invitation into a new life. That's exactly what Jesus' parables do. They invite us into something new, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of seeing ourselves, a new way of seeing our relationship to God. Here, they particularly invite us into a new understanding of the reign and realm of God, of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus uses that phrase several times in this passage in Matthew 13. Now, like I said a little bit before, when we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, we're not talking about the afterlife. We're not talking about a state of being when we die, but a state of being here, in this life, where we are aligned with God's purpose and action in this world, where we are immersed in love and acting that out. When Jesus declares that this kingdom has come, or is at hand, or is near, because he uses several different phrases, he's talking about the realization of living fully in God's way of love, and how his life and his ministry, the things he's showing us, expand that reality. Now, I love this concept in theology because it refocuses our love of others, not on earning points for ourselves for the afterlife, but of living into a new way right now, of creating a new reality. It's no surprise that Jesus uses parables to explain this new reality. Even with us having written accounts in the Gospels, and 2,000 years of Christian history, and thousands of people trying to live into the kingdom of heaven, we still usually don't understand what it means. And if we do catch a glimpse, it's only fleeting. I mean, can you stop and really imagine what it looks like to live in heaven now? So Jesus does what he does, and he uses parables, and he invites his listeners to imagine, to be challenged by this idea of fully living into divine love. Parables are great for how they help us keep seeking, keep returning to the text again and again. And they keep us asking, what am I still missing? So there are many things that we can begin to understand about the kingdom of heaven from just this set of parables that we read today. But I just want to look at two themes. The first is disruption, and the second is hospitality. Now, parables all have some element of surprise or irony or something that doesn't make sense in them. In the parable of the mustard seed, we have a perfectly good field being taken over by a mustard plant. This plant gets so big that birds can even begin to nest in it. Now, I am not the world's best gardener, but I do know that if you are preparing a plot for growing one particular thing, you don't want a tree taking up space, using up the nutrients in that soil, or shading what you're trying to grow. And you definitely don't want to be attracting birds that are going to be eating your crops. Whatever plans this farmer may have had for the field have now been disrupted, and they've been changed because of this tiny seed that works its way into the field and grows into a plant probably many times larger than whatever that farmer was planning on growing. The same is true with the next parable, where a woman sets an enormous amount of wheat to fermenting and rising by working yeast into it. And we're not talking about the powdered yeast that comes in an envelope or in a jar. We're talking about your well-developed COVID quarantine sourdough starter, a leaven. How would you ever use that much dough once it had been leavened? And then what if you needed it unleavened for the Sabbath? This woman who works this yeast, this leaven, into such a huge amount of flour is wasteful and foolish for preparing such a huge recipe of bread instead of just making what she needs for herself for that day. These first two parables in our reading, they're spoken to a crowd, a general audience that Jesus is addressing. But the next few, Jesus is speaking just to the disciples. He tells them that the kingdom of heaven is like something so valuable that when you run across it, you will give up everything you have just to have that one valuable thing. All your other plans, all your other budget items, all of the things you thought your life were about, all of those get put on hold so that you can own that one small, beautiful, valuable thing. In all of these parables, things get messed up. The people in the stories act in ways that are nonsensical, or the way of doing things like farming or baking or buying and selling is thwarted by this little bit of kingdom getting in. So that tells me that when we get a little bit of the kingdom in us, there's going to be disruption. That little bit of kingdom is going to change what our intentions and our plans are. Discovering just a small part of the kingdom of heaven changes our priorities. In my own experience, I've felt that disruption not just from a call to ministry, but from catching a glimpse of what the kingdom looks like. I used to joke that God had ruined my life because all the plans I had for myself, for a career, for all the ideas about who I was and what I believed mattered and what I wanted my life to look like, all of those changes. And one of those big changes for me was even whose voice I wanted to listen to, who I valued, and who I wanted to find myself in community with. Now, this brings up our second theme, hospitality. Jesus is preaching hospitality to two different groups here. Those hearing about the kingdom maybe for the first time, who are part of that general audience, and those who are supposedly committed to it, his disciples. For those hearing about the kingdom maybe for the first time, there is this surprise of the mustard seed and the yeast getting into something and growing. But there are also some references to sacred stories that we might miss, but that audience probably would have been familiar with. In the mustard seed parable, the image of the birds of heaven, it shows up in Ezekiel too. And that phrase refers to the Gentiles, to the nations, to the people who are outside of God's current covenant. So already here in hearing about the kingdom, this crowd is getting an idea that the kingdom of heaven is a way of being that is inclusive and open and welcoming. In the next parable to the crowd about the wheat and the yeast, there's that sheer amount of dough that this woman has now prepared, an enormous recipe of bread. That same measure that she makes is also used when Sarah, of Abraham and Sarah, is called on to prepare a meal for 100 people. So this is an enormous amount of dough, an amount that only makes sense if you're preparing to welcome a very large crowd. For the disciples, Jesus teaches them that in addition to being something so valuable, the kingdom is also like a net that catches all kinds of fish. The disciples themselves are not the ones who do the catching or who even sort out the fish, but all kinds are going to be brought in. So whether the hearers of these parables are newcomers or Jesus' own disciples, there's the same message. The kingdom of heaven is characterized by a big shift in the life you expect, in your priorities and values, and it's about welcome and abundance and the inclusion of the previously excluded. The kingdom of heaven is about a disruption of the way things have been, and it's about hospitality. These might seem like two separate characteristics, but I think that if we are really practicing a kingdom vision of hospitality, if we're really striving to include and welcome and call into community people who haven't been there before, then that in itself is going to disrupt us in a kingdom kind of way. Because real hospitality is not just saying, well, you can come if you want, or even saying, well, you're welcome here as long as you look and act like us. But instead, going all the way to a welcome that says, because you are so welcome here, because we see you as the beloved of God, we're going to change because of your presence. We're going to honor the image of God in you and be transformed ourselves because the picture of who God is and what the kingdom is like now is a little bit clearer because of your presence. Hospitality disrupts, and kingdom hospitality is a challenge to any status quo that we're living in. When we practice radical hospitality, our ways and our habits and our patterns will be changed. There are many ways that these parables can challenge us in our practices of hospitality and challenge us just to continue being challenged by the words of Jesus. But I wonder how well we communicate these aspects of the Christian life. Do we convey that this new way of being, immersed in God's love now rather than just waiting for something when you die, is going to disrupt our life? Do we practice hospitality in such a way, not just as a church, but as families and friends and individuals, that we show how radical God's hospitality is? How willing are we to be changed by our own practices of hospitality? So many people are like me when I was younger and had no idea that Christianity is really a beautiful, fulfilling, compelling, lifelong journey. So many people have not heard the good news that heaven is here and now, not later. So many people have never been introduced to Christianity as spirituality, and in their yearning for a new way of being have looked elsewhere because all they've ever heard from the church growing up was just a set of don'ts. So this week, I want to encourage you to share with your friends the disruption that knowing and seeing the kingdom has done in your life. I want to encourage you to practice hospitality in radical ways that change you and share that experience too. Show other people this crazy new way, this reign and realm of God, this heaven on earth that is defined by welcome and inclusion and a change and a rejection of the death-dealing status quo that so many of us live with. This good news isn't just for us within the church. In fact, it's for us to proclaim, because the kingdom is here. It is open to all, and it's changing the world.